Today is installment number 4 of 6 things not to give up for Lent. So far, we've talked about not giving up Jesus, not giving up joy, and not giving up tolerance. Today, we're going to talk about not giving up gratitude for Lent. And in order to tell the story of gratitude, I need to go through our gospel lesson one more time because the story's in there. Now, you know that gospel lesson was long, and none of us wants this sermon to be a half hour long, but there's a lot of words in front of me that I'm responsible for putting them there, I know, but there's still a lot there. So what I'm trying to say is I'm going to be speaking really fast. I have to get a lot more words in the same rough amount of time. So I'm warning you up front, buckle your seatbelts just a little bit, and here we go. So this is the Reader's Digest condensed version of this week's gospel lesson. So Jesus and his disciples are out on the road, and they suddenly come upon a man who has been blind since birth. And so Jesus spits on the ground, and he makes mud out of his spit, and for some reason, he takes his fingers and he puts it in that nasty junk, and he spreads that spitty mud stuff in the guy's eyes. I have no idea why he did that. I've heard sermons about it. I don't really believe any of them. I have no idea why he spit in the mud and put spitty mud in the guy's eyes, but that's what he did. And he tells the guy, go down to the pool at Siloam and wash the spitty mud out of your eyes, which I'm sure he was more than happy to do. And when he did, for the first time in his life, he could see. So, clearly, the fact that this guy who was blind and all he could do was beg, and now he's walking around looking at people, this kind of causes quite a stir in the old neighborhood. So the neighbors start talking. They're like, hey, that's the guy who used to be blind and just used to sit over there and beg. And other guys are going, no, it's just somebody who looks like him. And he's saying, no, I'm the guy. It was me. I was the guy. I used to be blind, and now I see. And they're like, no, he's just a guy who looks like that guy. And so they start to worry about the guy a little bit, and they need to know what's going on. So they take him to the temple. They take him to the temple. He has to meet with the Pharisees because they need to know whether or not this is a good thing. So, the Pharisees question the young man, and here's the thing that blows my mind about this whole thing. The Pharisees aren't the least bit impressed with the idea that this guy used to be blind and now he sees. They don't care. They're far more interested in proving that Jesus is a bad guy. They're trying to use the entire incident of a guy who'd been blind since birth to prove that Jesus is a bad guy. Strange. Now, they talk to him for a little while, and they're kind of confused themselves, and they finally decide, well, we don't believe he was really born blind. So they send him out, and they call his parents in. And they ask the parents, so what's the deal? And they're like, yeah, he's our son. Yeah, he was born blind, but other than that, we don't know what's going on. You might have heard that phrase, my name's Bennett and I'm not in it. That was his parents. They wanted nothing to do with the whole thing. They were afraid. They were afraid of the Pharisees. They were afraid of getting kicked out of church. They didn't want to get kicked out of church. They were afraid of what the neighbors were going to say. So they just say, I'm out. He's our son. He used to be blind. That's all we know. So the Pharisees call the guy back in. And they ask him the exact same questions that they asked him in the first place. And he lets them know that he's not all that impressed with their logic. And the whole conversation goes downhill very quickly, and they get very angry at him. In fact, verse 28 actually says these words, they reviled him. Those are strong words. They weren't mildly unhappy with him. They reviled him, and they drove him out of the temple. They threw him out of church. He was no longer welcome back. And so Jesus hears what's happened, and he goes and he finds the man who had been born blind, and he says, hey, I'm the guy who healed you. I'm the reason that you're not blind anymore, and I'm the Messiah. And the young man said, well, that's awesome. I believe. And he worshiped him, and some Pharisees are hanging out nearby, and they hear all this stuff going on, and they say, hey, we're not blind, are we? And Jesus says, well, if you were blind, you would not have sin, but now you say we see, your sin remains. Check and mate. Excuse me for just a second. It's a very shortened version of a very long reading. Now let's talk about how gratitude is expressed in this reading. The thing is, gratitude can be a very slippery thing to get a hold of. The fact is, all of us have been blessed with many gifts. We're blessed in where we were born. Let's face it, the United States isn't perfect. There's a lot worse places that we could have been born. When we were born, we're very blessed with when we were born. There have been much more difficult times in this world to be born than in the 20th and 21st centuries. We're, most of us, blessed because of the families that we were born into. Now, for some of you, that wasn't such a blessing. For some of you, maybe the family that you were born into was an obstacle to be overcome. But even then, you are blessed because here you are this morning and you have overcome and you're now part of a family of believers here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church. And as part of that family, you are loved unconditionally. Not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it, not because you're so awesome, but simply because you are a part of the family. It's just like the unconditional love of Jesus Christ. It's a gift. And it's very difficult to remember that. The gift part is very difficult to remember. So the fact is that our human nature biases us towards believing that any good thing that happens in our life is because we deserve it. Any good thing that happens to us is because we're really great and we had it coming. But then when bad stuff happens to us, we like to throw up our hands and say, oh, I don't know. There was nothing I could do about it. It's just all the forces of the world teaming up against me. Not through no fault of my own. I was just minding my own business, and all of a sudden, my whole world went to, I don't know, someplace in a handbasket, Salamanca in a handbasket, and it wasn't my fault. So that's kind of tough. That's kind of tough because that kind of stuff actually does happen. Those things do happen. Sometimes good stuff happens to us because we deserve it. We make good decisions, we work hard, and good stuff comes to us. Sometimes bad stuff happens to us, and it's completely outside of our control. There's nothing we can do about it. But you know what? A lot of times, really great stuff happens because we're blessed. I would argue most of the time, good stuff happens to us because we're blessed. You weren't born in America because you were so great. You weren't born in the 20th century because that's when you wanted to be born. You weren't born into a good family because you were just awesome and you deserved it. That's all blessing. And sometimes bad stuff happens to us because we make bad decisions and we do wrong things and we get stuck. But it happens the other way just often enough to trick us into believing that that's the way the world really works, that it's all about us, that we're awesome, and we should just keep doing exactly what we're doing. Now, how does that compare with the way that we think about circumstances that happen to other people, especially people that we don't care for so much? If somebody that we know that we don't really like that much, if something good happens to them, what do we say? Lucky. Man, they're so lucky. You know, they're stupid, they don't really deserve it, they're always doing stupid stuff, they don't deserve to have good stuff happen to them. And what happens when bad stuff happens to them? You're like, yeah, it's about time. It's about time. They had it coming. They had it coming. So our judgment, or the way we look at those things, tends to reverse whether we're thinking about ourselves as opposed to when we're thinking about somebody else. We're very gracious in judging our own life situations, and we're pretty judgmental sometimes judging other people's life situations. Now, that's another long story to get us to a shorter story. There's a group of people in our gospel reading this morning that thought the very same way. They were called the Pharisees. And they believed that if you were healthy, if you were wealthy, if life was going good for you and you were winning at life, it's because you're awesome and God loves you. God favored them, and he loved them more than people who weren't so healthy, people who weren't so wealthy, people who were sick. Those people were like that because they had it coming. People who, for instance, were born blind had it coming. So you shouldn't really feel that bad for them. The disciples even, this had been the way of thinking for so long that the disciples even thought that way. We see it in their question to Jesus when they first saw the man. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? See, the idea is that sin was involved. There was some reason that he deserved to be born blind. That's the only reason he could have been. And this was, at the time, and had been for quite a long while, the accepted medical and theological truth. It's also why the Pharisees could say that the man was a sinner since birth. In verse 34 there, you were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us? The Israelites believed that if somebody was born lame or blind or with any kind of disability, it was because either they sinned in the womb or their mother sinned while they were in the womb. It also helps us to understand why every time when the Pharisees were, every time Jesus performed some kind of miraculous healing, which was quite often, right, in the Gospels, every time that happened, the Pharisees weren't that impressed. But they did want to use those to make Jesus look bad. They were upset at Jesus for healing people because he was upsetting the order of things. You see, those people that were poor, that were begging, that had leprosy, that couldn't walk, that couldn't see, they had it coming. They had it coming. It was their fault, and it was the proper punishment for them. And Jesus came, and he was screwing up the whole deal because he was actually healing them as if they had it coming, as if they were people that were worthy of something good happening to them, like the Pharisees were convinced that they were. So, to get to the idea of gratitude in the story, I want to look at the attitudes of the different groups of people in the story after the healing had taken place. And I want to start with the neighbors. The neighbors were confused. Let's face it, if we were neighbors, we would have been confused too. They kept asking each other, isn't that the blind kid from next door? And he kept assuring him that it was, but instead of just being happy that their neighbor, who used to be blind, who had been blind his entire life, instead of just being happy that he could now see, they decided they had to take him to the temple. And the Pharisees would tell them whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that he wasn't blind anymore. So I would say in the neighbors, we don't see much gratitude. We don't see loving neighbor as self there. Now, I want to take a look at the response of the Pharisees. They were everything but grateful. The Pharisees were angry, they were childish, they were accusatory, they were dictatorial, and when they didn't like the young man's answers, they drove him out of the temple. The Pharisees literally threw this young man out of the church, kicked him out, told him don't come back, because he had been healed of blindness. Not a lot of gratitude in that response. How about the parents? The parents may have been happy for the young man. I'm not very sure. You couldn't prove it by their response. They certainly didn't want any trouble. I think they were more afraid of the authorities than they were grateful for the young man's healing. I get the sense for them that by the time they got called in front of the Pharisees, they had kind of decided that it just wasn't worth it. The healing wasn't worth the trouble that came along with it. No gratitude with the parents. How about the young man? How about the young man? He said a couple things. He said, all I know is that I was blind and now I see. And then he said, I believe, and he worshiped God. He got it. He showed true gratitude. He realized that he hadn't been blessed with sight because he was better than somebody else or because he deserved it or because he was a great guy, that it was simply a blessing straight from God. He realized he was blessed, and because he realized he was blessed and he wasn't just receiving what he had earned, he was filled with gratitude. So family, it is important for us not to give up gratitude for Lent. And I think we can do that if we remember that the blessings that are showered on us by our Heavenly Father are just that. They're blessings, they're gifts. They're not earned. They're not deserved. And when things are going badly in your life, think about that a little bit more. And if things are going badly in your life because you're making bad decisions, you know what? That happens sometimes. It happens to all of us. And when you realize that things are going bad for you because you've made some bad decisions, it's fairly simple. You just repent. You say, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to try to do better in the future. And things are going to work out okay. And sometimes we do have those seasons in our lives when things just don't really go our way, and it really isn't because of us. We need to just remember in those times that, into every life, a little rain must fall. We need to remember what David said in the Psalms when he said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Okay, that's kind of a sign of things going pretty bad. Nobody ever really said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," with a great big grin on their face going, "Yeah, I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death. This is awesome." That means things aren't going real well in your life. Even then, God is with us. We are His beloved children, and we are blessed. And when we get kind of dragged down into some difficult times, we just need to hang tight and see if there's something that we can learn from those times and know that those blessings are going to come back. So, I would say, if you're going to judge and you're going to judge harshly, save that harsh judgment for yourself. Watch your attitude towards other people. Put the best possible construction on everything. Just assume that if somebody is having a really hard time, if somebody is suffering, just make the assumption that it's not their fault. You might be right, you might be wrong. Just make the assumption, because it really doesn't matter. What matters is they're having a hard time and they need some help. If you feel the need to judge yourself more harshly than you judge others, but better yet, be kind to yourself as well. Have an attitude of gratitude. Family, we become the God we worship. In other words, our image of God creates us. Give up that image of an angry, vengeful, judgmental God and give that up for the God of love and grace and mercy. And if you will do that, you will grow into people that are more loving, more graceful, more filled with mercy, and you will find it much easier to live the life of gratitude that Jesus has called you to. Amen. And be sure to be here next week when our sermon theme will be "Don't Give Up Optimism for Lent."